The African American Legends highlights the accomplishments of Black Americans in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Herb Boyd, feature writer for the New York Amsterdam News. Welcome to African American
Roscoe,
Legends.
baby? How you doing?
Well, a lot of politics going on here. Now, let's talk about New York State.
Sure.
The state Senate is going Republican, and they're talking about cutting back on the budget and so on, along with the governor. The House of Representatives is going Republican. They're talking about repealing the health care bill and setting up draconian budget cuts. How do you think it's going to affect the Black community, and what can we do about it, if anything?
Well, Wendy, I'm glad you asked that question because I just finished doing a piece called, check this title now, "The Black Canaries Are Dying." You know, there was a time when miners in this country, American miners, when they went down into these shafts and everything, they always took a canary with them.
Yeah.
And the canary was there to kind of alert them to whether there's gas leaks. The canary started keeling over, they know something's wrong down
Get
there.
out of here.
Yeah, but I think young Black men may be our canaries for our economic situation in this country. Once upon a time, and I come out of Detroit, you know, originally, and the automobile industry was like the real hub of the economy, along with small businesses in this country. And the manufacturing base, you know, we outsourced the manufacturing base, or the automation has come in and virtually destroyed that. Young Black men, for example, they talk about 9.4 unemployment rate. That's unrealistic and not at all reliable when it comes to young Black males. We know that in some of the urban centers, it may be as high as 50%, if not higher. So I say that look at the Black male condition in this country. We talk about the canaries, and that's a good social and economic indicator about where we are as a country. And we're hoping that the whole Obama administration become cognizant of that. But at the same time, you're looking at the recalcitrants coming from the Republicans, the kind of party of no. And I think you make a good point in terms of looking at the contrast or the comparison between what's happening here in New York State, where now we have the Senate controlled by the Republicans. We still got the Assembly. And of course, we got the gubernatorial office too. In a way, the same way we can contrast that with our national government, in which we have the Republicans, you know, they took control of Congress, but we still got the Senate, and we still got the executive office with Obama. So you have these what called checks and balances there to hold them off.
It's a little different in New York State in that the reason for this is the budget deficit.
$10 billion.
And the governor is talking about the deficit, and we're going to have to cut programs. When you talk about cutting programs, the majority of the budget is education and health care. So the question is,
particularly Medicaid.
And when you cut these programs, how is it going to affect the Black community, the minority community? And the other point that some people are now looking at is maybe citizens are realizing that instead of having programs cut, they need to take a small tax increase because a 2% increase in, a 2.5% increase in taxes would bring billions of dollars.
Yes.
So that's a push-pull.
Oh, yes.
It's a question of whether it's a rhetorical push-pull or whether it's an actual push-pull. In the case of New York State, as you say, the Assembly probably will not vote for that.
Yes.
The Senate, which has a 2-vote Republican majority, might vote for it. Then you have a sort of a gridlock there.
Yes,
and
a continuing gridlock.
And the other issue is pensions, because part of this accounting deficit is the future amount that the state will be responsible for pensions. And because many of the pensions are very high, the question is, can they handle it?
Can they handle it? Well, that seems
so if you were a legislator, Herb Boyd, see, you write about this stuff, how would you approach it?
Well, one of the things about this is that it has to be across the board. And we know, and I think you were right in suggesting that education and healthcare, Medicaid in particular, are the kind of the heavy ends of our budget. We're talking about a $10 billion deficit. Already he's saying that what he's going to lay off some 15,000 state workers. What's that, about 7% of the workforce? Is about 200,000 employees in the state. So that's a considerable number being cut. At the same time, you're talking about the $1 billion, shaving that he's going to do when it comes to education and Medicaid. I think what the Medicaid, well, overall, the state budget is something like, I guess, $63 billion. About $23 billion goes to education. I think $53 billion goes to Medicaid. So that's a considerable, if you're going to do any cutting, trimming, slicing, then it probably has to go with education. Of course, that does not resonate very well for us downstate because we've always taken the short end of the stick when it comes to education budget, because we got more than 1/3 of the student population, but we don't get 1/3 of the budget.
Particularly in New York City, they had the Campaign for Fiscal Equity suit, where the state is required to equalize the funding between the suburbs and the cities.
Yes.
But if they don't have the money, they may not be able to do it.
Yes.
I think what they're talking about is restructuring the systems. For example, in Medicaid, possibly some people who now claim eligibility by divesting themselves of the resources may not be able to do that as much, that some of the administrative fees may not be as high. In the case of education, I know in New Jersey they're putting a cap on school superintendent salaries, which was sometimes larger than the corporate executives who were paying the taxes. So I think what this requires is a sober analytical approach rather than a combative approach, because in a combative approach, maybe the best idea doesn't come through.
But doctor, you're going to have some combat when it comes to the unions. You know they're not going to sit by passively and allow these cuts to go down.
And they shouldn't.
I mean, but everybody has their own vested interests. You're trying to hold on to your particular turf, hold on to your particular budget. But the sacrifices are going to have to come across the board. I mean, you just can't pick on one to the expense of the other.
Of course, many people feel that a lot of people are doing very, very well, and they ought to assume the burden in terms of increased taxes, et cetera.
Yes.
The conservatives say if you increase the taxes, they'll leave, they go to Florida, they put the money in the Cayman Islands. So there's, as I said, there is a push-pull, and I think the major issue is for whoever is in the electorate to realize that the purpose of being there is to help the citizens, to help the quality of life, not necessarily just to make money. And that's a push-pull that comes in with the unions, it comes in with the executives, it comes with the corporations. So it'll be an interesting thing. What impact do you think black elected officials in New York State will have? And then I'll ask about the nation.
Yeah, one of the things about this, I guess we only have, we got John Sampson there, who's a minority leader.
Of the Senate.
In the Senate, right? We still have, we got Bill Perkins, we got Keith Wright, who can go to bat for us, Denny Farrell. We have some people up there who can go to bat for us, but you're waging a struggle up there, and I think we should get back to that point about who has to take the burden of this, because you're talking about taxing the rich, taxing the wealthy here.
And taxing, basically, if you tax the wealthy, you wouldn't get enough money. You have to tax the middle class.
Yes,
and that's
but not as much. That's what we're saying.
That is exactly the point.
Exactly.
Now, that goes to the national picture, because President Obama is talking about how do you balance the federal deficit. And supposedly, the health care bill will help to reduce the deficit, yet the Republicans want to eliminate
it completely.
They want to eliminate some parts of it, maybe all of it.
But I don't think it's going to happen.
I don't think it's going to happen, but I think the reason for this has to do with who initiated it.
Yes.
The Democrats and President Obama initiated it. But what the public isn't made aware of is that about 50 or 60% of what's in the health care bill was something the Republicans created and advocated some years ago.
Right, right.
So you talked about the party of no. What do you think is the motivation is behind the party of no?
I think one of the basic motivations is that they'll be probably eternally disgruntled that we got a black president.
Well,
you know, I think
you said a black president. Some people say a Democratic president.
Yeah, right.
I think you probably could say a Democratic president who's black.
Black Democratic president, right? But I think one of the things about this is that, okay, you always have the kind of philosophical, the ideological division, and what I think Obama expended an enormous amount of political capital with this whole bipartisan thing. And I think...
and that has helped him with his ratings. His approval ratings are back up to 50.
Back up to 50, but I think a large part of that may have been coming out of the Tucson incident, which of course maybe we want to talk a little bit about the gun violence in our society, but his speech there, and of course he's a master orator, he was able to, I think, get a lot of points and maybe lift up those polls and everything where he had been flagging, and to bring it up to the kind of 50% you're talking about. That could be temporary. You know, all these things that come
Depending on the economy. If people if 10 million people are out of work, you got a real problem.
Exactly. So I think that's a critical thing in terms of joblessness in the economy in the long run. Those would be the critical things, along with financial reform and what happens with immigration, and certainly the war going on in Afghanistan would be critical issues.
But you made the point that the major objection was because he was a black president. Do you think it's because he was a president who's black, or because of the policies that he advocates will help a larger number of people rather than a smaller group of people who represent the affluence in the Republican Party? What do you think about that?
I think it could be a thing where you are talking about the race question in this country it'd be a long time, because they start talking about a post-racial society with him coming into office.
People don't talk about that anymore.
I mean, that just show you how ridiculous it was to begin with, nowhere near that. But at the same time, you're talking about the emergence of the Tea Party and what it means out there, the ongoing recriminations that's coming from these adversaries out there charging that the man was not born here, that he's a closet Muslim, and now even when meeting with the President Hu of China, that he's a communist. So that proves that he's a communist, meeting with...
But do you think that's based on race or ignorance or envy?
Probably all of the above, all of the above, Roscoe. I think that's certainly, all of these things have to be taken into the mix. And when you talk about a president who, I think for the most part, he's a pragmatist. He's been very, very pragmatic in a lot of
Which has turned off some of the liberals.
Yeah, but I think he's moving toward triangulation, that is, toward a centrist thing. And of course, that's got to be expected when you're moving into 2012 elections. Where does he stand?
He is the president of 308 million people,
exactly,
of whom only 41 million are African American.
And how can you charge? And he diffused this whole notion that he's like, I'm a president of Black America.
Yeah,
you know, forget that. I'm the president of all Americans. But nonetheless, you have people who are trying to suggest the kind of special interest that he has for certain groups out there, which is on the face of it absurd, because he's first quickly to renounce and denounce any possibility of that. And some of the legislative and some of the positions he's taken out there, I mean, don't ask, don't tell. It took him a long time, you know, to get around to that. And a lot of people waiting, what's going to happen with spending cuts? You know, what's going to happen with the economy? Whether you're going to talk about this competitiveness, and we get to jobs as his State of the Union address comes up. So we're curious to see how some of these things play out in terms of both the domestic and the international situation.
See, you're really hitting on this. You've developed a new book called Civil Rights, Yesterday and Today, and there's a picture of Martin Luther King and Barack Obama. Tell us about what inspired you to write this book. Tell us what's in the book. How does it relate to today?
Well, one of the things, you notice the title there, Yesterday and Today. So often when you have, Dr. Brown, a book about the civil rights movement, it's almost like, boop, centered totally on that. It doesn't get beyond that. It looks at, up to 1968 with the assassination of Dr. King, and it's all over. But we try to show here Todd Burrows, and of course the forward by Congressman John Lewis, try to get him aboard. Oh, brother, he kind of, and the photos suggest this continuity, and I always stress that in all of my books, and it happens here, is showing that it's not, you can't compartmentalize our history. I mean, the music industry does it all the time. You know, the blues is here, the jazz is here, gospel is over here. It's easier, and social scientists do it too, because it's easier then to handle matter in motion. But we talk about the continuity from out of the civil rights movement into Black power, into the Black liberation struggle. From a political standpoint, there's continuity. From a cultural standpoint, there's continuity from the Harlem Renaissance down to the Black arts movement, to the contemporary music situation around the hip-hop union, hip-hop communities, rap music. There's a continuity for all of this here. So what we do here is to show that, okay, not only Dr. King, but also that an Obama would not be there without the civil rights movement. Without, he stands on the shoulders of some real giants out there.
I think that President Obama does and did recognize the historic aspect of his being the first Black presidential candidate. On the other hand, because of the nature of our society, he couldn't say he was a Black presidential candidate. He said he was an American presidential candidate, and I think he's carried that out in his administration, to the consternation of some Blacks and some liberals. But the fact is that given that this tends to be a centrist country, 3 percentage points on one side, 3 percentage points on the other side make a big difference. Now, Al Gore won the 2000 election, but he lost because of the Supreme Court. So you have to be careful how you deal with that.
Oh, yes.
Now, one of the things that I like to think about in this new political arena is how other Blacks will advance in the larger mainstream of things. We've had Jim Clyburn, who's the majority now minority whip, and we've had some other great influx into the political scene. How do you think this is going to work out in, let's say, places like New York and Chicago?
Well, Chicago, well, here in New York, of course, we're talking about, I mean, comparing New York and Chicago is always like apples and oranges to a great degree, but there's a lot of similarities, a lot of commonalities at the same time in terms of the kind of political consciousness and awareness of the general voting populace. They're very much in touch with what's going on and get involved in the situation, more so than a lot of the other urban centers. But one thing about Chicago, very interesting developments in Chicago here lately with Rahm Emanuel, you're being kicked off the ballot, pretty much leaves a clear field for Carol Moseley.
However, right now we don't know whether to get back on.
Yeah, it could be, like I say, it's an appeal situation.
But there is a question in terms of how the Black political establishment or community selects a candidate and supports a candidate. I understand in Chicago there was someone who was more popular than Carol Moseley Braun. I understand here in New York we're trying to find out which of our various Black political leaders we're going to select to move ahead. So it's a dynamic that's going on all the time there.
Yeah, but we got a Freedom Party situation here. Very interesting development there to see how that plays out, particularly if they move into the conventional format, where they can, out of the convention, you can have like a solid candidate to run for governor or what have you. In Chicago, you have a number of candidates there who stepped out of the race. I mean, in terms of the unity move there was very, very, I say, whoa, Chicago, talking about unifying.
But sometimes unity comes from pressure from the top.
Well, that's what happened. They said we recognize, say we can't have our vote diffused because you have so many candidates out there, then they kind of nullify each other. So we say, okay, let's just step back. Danny Davis, who's a congressman
That's the
there.
person we were talking about.
Yeah, he stepped out. Joseph Tucker, who's a very important religious leader on the South Side, he stepped out. And here's Carol left to go up against Rahm Emanuel. Let's see how it plays out there.
Let's see how it plays out.
Sure.
Well, recently the Schomburg Center for Research in Blood Culture had its 85th anniversary celebration. And they talked about, in a sense, the history of the civil rights movement and the value of a place like the Schomburg in our society. How did you respond to that concept of the whole train of our society being reflected in those various parts of the Schomburg?
Well, the Schomburg is a very important, probably one of the most significant institutions, cultural, political, social institutions that we have in this country in terms of as a repository. They're talking about, what, 10 million now?
Yeah.
I think it started off when Arturo Alfonso.
100,000.
Yeah, they had, well, actually it was like 10,000.
Yeah.
It was 10,000. Now it's 10 million. And some very important collections there, including Malcolm X. You know, I was there when all those artifacts came in. So, and looking at that, just a recent 85th anniversary celebration is exemplary of the kind of archival material that they have there, because you had images that was coming obviously right out of their repository.
All
right
of the
out
images
their
in the presentation.
Everything was there, so they could put on a really a phenomenal show like that because they had all that stuff at their beck and call.
But the question that I have is, how do we get the younger generation, the 20s and the 30s, to understand this? Because clearly, fortunately, kids who were 20 grew up in an entirely different world that you and I and some of the people that we admire in our civil rights history. How are we going to do that?
I think we have to meet, to a large degree, we're going to meet them where they are. We got to meet them where they are. Many of them are into the social networking. Many of them into the short attention span. They got the Twitter, they're into the Twitter and everything. The technology at the Schomburg is have to meet where these young people are. They come out of a generation. I mean, when you look at the whole presidential situation, when FDR was coming along, it was the radio, it was fireside chats. You know, when Kennedy came, as television was beginning to open up. We're in the internet age now. And so they will have to find the interactive aspects will have to be really shored up. So when young people come there, they'll be able to do the same kind of things they're used to doing, you know, with their whole, on their iPads, iPhones, and what have you. They have to be made available there. And I think they'll find that it's there, but they have to be brought there. But they have to be induced to come.
History is about ideas, not about people. The people are reflective of the ideas. And when you talk about the, as you have in your book, about the evolution from slavery to segregation to civil rights to integration to a black president, people have to know how we got there. If somebody asked you, how did we get to the place in 2011 where we have a black president, what would you say the major factor in getting there was?
Struggle.
Okay, but
Absolute
what aspects
struggle.
of the struggle?
Well, I think it's cultural, it's political, it's social, it's identity, it's religious.
Okay, let's pick up on some of those.
Okay.
To what extent did the black identity movement help us in moving ahead in terms of these social changes that we made?
I think one of the things about, you have to know who you are as a people. Self-identity, self-actualization, I mean, that's absolutely required, you know, for people to place themselves within the context of human history. Dr. John Henry Clark used to tell me all the time, he says, black history is the missing pages of world history. We have to, and this is something that Mr. Schomburg talked about all the time when he's talking about the Negro digs up his past. In other words, you have the kind of a Sankofa thing where the Sankofa bird it fades forward, but it looked back. So we have to understand where we've come from, where we are, and where we need to go as a people. Now, so identity is always important there because it's self-concept, self-actualization has to be acquired.
What about young folks who talk about a post-racial society? I don't think there is such a thing right now, but how do you relate to them on that point?
I think some of the young men ought to just go ahead and stand out there on Fifth Avenue. It'll come home to them right away, the cab's going right past them, knowing full well. Or to look at the whole level of police brutality in our society and the number of young black people who, particularly young black men who are at the mercy of this brutal, trigger-happy cops in our society. That should be an indication right away that it's not a post-racial society whatsoever. These young people are still the targets, you know, of a very brutal law enforcement agency.
So what should the young people be doing to help move ahead toward a society where race doesn't matter as much, it'll always matter? What should they be doing?
I think one of the things that both our elders and our younger people is to find some common ground. We have to have some kind of a dialogue and discord. Intergenerational dialogue is just absolutely.
What would be the focus of that?
Excuse me?
What would be the focus
of the dialogue?
Yeah.
I think one of the things would be history. Because sometimes
reading Herb Boyd's book.
No, communication is very important because sometimes, you know, you just don't hook up. Like you take the N word, for example, what it may mean for one generation, what it means for another generation. Should we come together and understand, let me tell you why I'm offended by that. You know, sit down and have a heart-to-heart for the young people. And the young person, well, we've tried to diffuse it by this, that, and the other. Tactically, you know, here's what we were trying to do, or culturally it evolved to that. So we have to have that kind of discussion to understand the origins of our difficulties. How can we move past that through dialogue and discussion? So often you have these conferences, Doc, and you have nothing but old folks on the panel. Then you have another conference, and nothing but young folks on the panel. Why not have a situation where we have the young and the old come together, and male and female too?
And Herb Boyd from the Amsterdam News will help us to do that. Thanks for being with us on today's African American Legend.
It's a pleasure.